Welcome to Tiski Sour. I want to start the show with a big thank you to our viewers and especially our donors. 2 weeks ago, we launched a campaign to make £25,000 so we could move studio. And within those 2 weeks, just before midnight on Sunday, we got there. So we are now in a very good place to be moving slightly down the road and closer to the tube station in the next few weeks. That means we'll be in a bigger studio, it'll be comfier, and it'll be easier to get guests here. Though, as ever, we still rely on more of your support. You know, we don't just want a bigger, comfier studio. We want some full-time staff in there. So to get us to that stage, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. I don't normally start with the call out for money, but I'm doing it because it's a special occasion. We just finished our £25,000 fundraiser.
To celebrate achieving our fundraiser goal, you got out the begging bowl at the beginning of the show.
Exactly. I got carried away.
Yeah.
In the studio today, I am joined by David Graeber, world-renowned anthropologist and author of Debt, the First 5,000 Years and Bullshit Jobs, A Theory. I'm also joined by Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media and author of Fully Automated Luxury Communism. Thank you both for joining me this evening. We're going to start by talking about the grim news that Donald Trump has withdrawn support for the Syrian Kurds. So I'll do an introduction. We start the show with the grim news that Donald Trump has announced the US will be removing their support for the Syrian Kurds in Rojava, giving the green light for Turkey to invade. Rojava, the name for the Kurdish region of northeastern Syria, has captured the imagination of the international left since the Kurds there gained de facto autonomy in 2012 amid the deadly chaos of the Syrian civil war. Since 2012, Rojava has been organised as a secular and democratic community inspired by libertarian socialist ideology. It has also been the key force on the ground in Syria responsible for the defeat of ISIS. Throughout the Syrian civil war, the Kurds have been the most reliable ally of the United States, with the latter providing the air cover necessary to defeat Islamic State. And the US have up to now provided Syrian Kurds with protection from Turkish invasion. The background there is that Recep Erdogan, Turkey's president, has throughout the Syrian civil war seen the empowerment of Kurds as the biggest geostrategic threat to Turkish interests, believing it will fuel the struggle for Kurdish autonomy and Kurdish self-determination within Turkish borders. But since Monday, that American support has now been withdrawn. Trump announced yesterday on Twitter that the US would no longer provide military cover for the Syrian Kurds, and the White House has confirmed with Erdogan that Turkey could, and this is in the words of the White House press officers, move forward with its long-planned operation into northern Syria. And we're going to move on to the immediate implications of that decision, what that will say for people on the ground there. But I wanted to start with, I suppose, a bit of an introduction to the struggle in Rojava, especially from your perspective. You've been someone who's been following this for a while now. A few years, yeah. So I wonder if you could explain, I suppose, to the audience why you've been so interested in what's going on there, and a bit of background to, I suppose, why do the left follow what's going on there?
Well, I mean, this is one of the most exciting political experiments, really, since the anarchists in Spain in the 1930s. This is one of the few occasions when people have actually had a extensive stretch of territory in which to try to see if libertarian socialist ideas can really be put into practice and actually work on the ground, with a lot of really startling success, to be honest. I first found out about the revolution in Rojava when people there contacted me. And, you know, at first I think everyone reacted with a certain degree of incredulity. I mean, is this really true? Could this be happening? Could all of this been happening for all these years and I'd never heard about it? But, you know, the more I learned, the more I was really struck by how profound an historical experiment it really was.
In what way? What does that mean?
I mean, what we're talking about is really something that started within the PKK, which is the guerrilla movement, and it's a larger political movement within Turkey, which is originally a separate Marxist-Leninist separatist movement. Over time, it has evolved, and often this is attributed, you know, almost exclusively to the personality of one person, or the head of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, although, in fact, a lot of what happened within the PKK was the result of internal struggle, especially women's struggle within the organization itself. What Öcalan has to be, his credit is that he was open to it, which for the most part these sort of old patriarchal Marxist-Leninist types are not. And gradually over time, PKK transformed from a relatively traditional national liberation struggle to was pushing for a separate Kurdish state to something really different. A group whose major planks are social ecology, a lot of it inspired by Murray Bookchin. Although they have their own version of democratic confederalism that they've developed, partly based on their own experience, partly on Kurdish traditions, and partly based on anarchist theory. So you have social ecology, direct democracy, and women's liberation being sort of primary planks of a social struggle, which no longer actually desires a separate state at all. In fact, sees itself as in essential opposition to the very idea of a state. This is something which we haven't seen anything really like it happen in many years. I mean, there's the Zapatistas. This is the closest parallel one can think of. But even the Zapatistas don't really control a contiguous territory, whereas these people actually do.
And there's been, I suppose, what could seem a somewhat bizarre or strange or unlikely alliance between this movement in Rojava, libertarian socialist, and the United States. So it was the combination of those two forces that was capable of defeating ISIS since 2014, and it is protection from the United States. It's protected Rojava from other enemies, well, Turkey, which is what we'll get onto in a moment.
If you want me to do the background, I can. It was a PKK originally that had this profound transformation. What happened in Syria was PYD. It was a political party with very similar ideology. Also follows the writings of Öcalan and whatnot. They're not directly connected, but during the Syrian Revolution, essentially, the Syrian government pulled out of that area. It had been very strongly organized, the Kurdish parts of Syria. And negotiations ensued, and they basically talked the Syrian forces into just pulling out and leaving people there to handle their own affairs. They took everything when they left. Down to the light bulbs, all government offices were stripped of everything. The Syrian government essentially, and the sort of lackeys and flunkies and sort of magnates who had privatized all the stuff and really sort of crony capitalists all took off too. So they were in an incredibly advantageous situation. All the government buildings had nothing in them, but they were empty. And they suddenly had the situation where they were actually able to put the things they'd been working out and discussing in theory for 20 years into effect. Now, at first, basically nobody noticed them. Then there were several attacks from various jihadists, largely who seemed to have been funded, if not absolutely directed by the Turkish secret police. But gradually, the Kurdish region ended up in a conflict with ISIS. The origins of ISIS still remain obscure, but it's very clear that Turkish intelligence, along with various Gulf state intelligence, had a lot to do with putting them together. And they seem to have coordinated quite well with Turkish authorities of various kinds. They're trading with Turkey. For example, during the height of ISIS, the Caliphate was openly trading oil with Turkey while the Kurdish region was under total embargo. They couldn't even bring in.
Erdogan's son-in-law was involved, wasn't he?
Yes, he was indeed.
I believe was the Minister for Energy or something.
Yeah.
It was like openly
it was pretty up. It's one of these situations where everyone in the region knows what's going on, but you're not allowed to say it on TV outside of, in Europe or America. They constantly find high-ranking ISIS officers when they killed them, with Turkish intelligence ID in their pockets. Really blatant stuff like that. But still, somehow everyone's like, how could you possibly suggest that a NATO ally is dealing with ISIS here? We're all not supposed to talk about it. But so ISIS was just essentially acting as a Turkish proxy, was trying to take out the Kurdish region of North Syria to consolidate their power there, and especially to consolidate the border with Turkey, which is where they're getting their supplies. They went after Kobane, which is the flattest area and the easiest to attack, and it turned into this epic struggle in which essentially the U.S. was forced for various reasons to align themselves with people who are basically very close to a bunch of anarchists. It's a very weird historical situation, but they were caught in the middle, and eventually an alliance of convenience followed. I always emphasize this was a military alliance and not a political alliance. For example, the American government has never supported Rojava being part of the peace process in Syria. They don't have a place at the table at all, even though these tiny little political parties basically represent nobody on the ground do. Russia actually supports Rojava being in the peace process, and America doesn't. Most people don't know that. There was a military alliance simply because they both had the same enemy. And as a result, there have been certain attachments, that particularly personal attachments. A lot of the Americans who were down there ended up feeling, well, these guys are our friends, they're the only people who we could actually trust, and feel very strongly that they shouldn't be thrown to the wolves. There's also a practical matter. A lot of the American officers say, well, look, if we ally with someone and then allow them to be completely wiped out the moment they're no longer convenient to us by our own allies, well, no one's ever going to ally with us again.
And that's a debate that's going on in the United States
right now.
Yeah. Aaron, you wanted to...
Yeah, the thing about military alliances, and this is something which most members of the British or American public will be completely unaware of. In Iraq in recent years, the US haven't just been working alongside Shia non-state actors; they've been actively working alongside the Iranians.
Oh yeah.
US special forces were seen wearing, for instance, clothes of Kurdish Peshmerga in Iraq. At the same time, like you say, they're working alongside the SDF in Syrian Kurdistan. And that's fine. Those are entirely pragmatic, necessary alliances in times of war. But it's incredibly odd, the lack of journalistic coverage it's had from someone like the BBC. Just trying to give a decent, impartial overview of what's going on, because that complexity, I think allows the audience, allows the general public to appreciate that any solution will necessarily have to also be sufficiently complex. There's no simple solution here. When you have a military alliance in Iraq, which includes Iran, the US, Kurdish, Iraqi Kurds, similarly, if you have something similar in de facto, you had the same thing in Syrian Kurdistan, let's be real. You've got Assad and the Russians and the Iranians on one side. Tacitly, the SDF are not saying anything, but they're not fighting one another. And the Americans are providing the SDF air support, but they still hate Assad and the Russians and the Iranians. I just think a bit more of an honest national conversation about these tensions would be very helpful. Sadly, they're not. What really summed this up for me was I saw some American Twitter account, Trump supporter, saying, "Oh, actually, the YPG, the sort of these fighting forces in Syria and Kurdistan allied to the PKK, the YPG aren't all that good because they support Antifa." So they can't be good because Antifa are a terrorist organization. You think, well, the only people these guys are killing are, generally speaking, ISIS and adjacent political organizations.
They don't seem to understand that ISIS is far.
Yeah,
they're fascists.
And that level of complexity, I think, again, we should be talking about this. And it shouldn't just be like Navarra on the left and David Gray, but once in a while on the BBC, it should be a perfectly legitimate mainstream thing to be talking about.
The BBC has never put me on this topic.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I should.
I want to talk a bit more about the relationship between the US and Turkey during this whole period, because I think it's easy to understand how the military alliance against ISIS worked. It was the United States wanted to defeat ISIS. The Kurds were on the ground and willing to, and also needed to defeat ISIS. And so you had air power, American planes that were giving backup to Kurds on the ground.
Right.
ISIS, although obviously the threat hasn't subsided, and we might come back to whether the latest developments risk their return, but they haven't been the most mortal threat, as it were, to the Syrian Kurds for a while. That's been coming from Turkey, who want to destroy them for geostrategic reasons. And it's been America, as far as I understand it, that has been protecting the Syrian Kurds from a Turkish invasion.
This is actually a very fascinating story because, first of all, when we're talking about the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds at this point, well, some people collapse the Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds into the same thing, which is absurd. But even saying the Syrian Kurds at this point isn't exactly accurate, because what you have is the Democratic Confederation of North Syria. Like, the SDF is now mainly Arab. It's minority Kurd in the military forces now. Yeah, and what they have is a model which has actually been quite appealing. When last time I was there, about a year and a half ago, they said one of their big problems is what to do with former ISIS people who want to join.
Can I ask a question then? Can I ask a question? So if it's now minority Kurd, to what extent can this accurately be called a national liberation struggle then? Or is it not?
Well, they see it as a Syrian national liberation struggle. They very much see what they're doing as in the context of Syria. Part of
there's no sort of broader conversation about a united Kurdistan. I always thought it was confederalism within the context of broader Kurdistan.
It is. It's both. I mean, what they want to do is promote the confederal model within Iraq, within Syria, within Turkey, hopefully Iran, as a long-term goal. And in that context, they can also confederate across borders in various social, cultural, so forth ways. But the ultimate idea is not to challenge the national borders, and to accomplish the goal, they have to actually operate in the national field. So the democratization of Syria is actually their primary goal.
So they don't want to secede from Syria.
No, not at all. No, any more than the PKK want to secede from Turkey anymore. But in a way that makes them an even greater threat, because losing your territory is a threat, but having your entire system of government challenged is a lot more of one. They become a revolutionary organization which wants to essentially democratize Turkish society, or democratize Syrian society in a deep, very profound and fundamental way.
Interesting.
And so, but I mean, the reason that Turkey is so keen to, I suppose, destroy this movement is because of its association with Kurdish liberation, right? Even if it's not because the Turkish Kurds actually want to secede from Turkey, it's that they want to have a bigger, say, democratized Turkey, and that's a threat to Erdogan.
Yes, and it's also a political threat. I mean, Erdogan is essentially a fascist. He's right-wing populist, if you want to use that kind of language, tied with various Islamist factions, and these guys are his ultimate enemy. It's not just that; they're mostly Kurds. The HDP, which is the party that's originally came out of the Kurdish movement, did a very successful bid to rally much broader left-wing support, uniting with everyone from other religious minorities to gay and lesbian groups to labor unions. Thus getting themselves over the 20% mark and into parliament, which was essentially created so as to ensure that Kurdish-based parties could never be in parliament. And it was at that point that Erdogan sort of broke his ceasefire with the PKK and started the war again, when it became a credible left-wing threat in the country itself.
And so let's talk about the most recent developments, right? So the reason that Rojava has been somewhat insulated from Turkish aggression up to now is because they've had air cover, I think, from the United States.
They've had air cover alliance from the U.S. They've had basically human shields. American troops are there. They don't do a lot of combat, but a lot of them are just simply sitting there so that if Turkey invades, they would have to kill Americans, which they know they can't do without creating a huge scandal. Interestingly enough, the Rojava sort of diplomatic people were trying their best to sort of balance sides against each other. So originally, they essentially had American human shields in the eastern part of Rojava. There's the Afrin, which is this isolated western canton, which they had been trying somehow to unite with the rest. That one was allied with Russia. So there were Russian human shields and observation posts, they were called, on the border there. And the Russians basically screwed them. This is actually really important because a lot of people say, well, they chose their allies. They could have allied with Russia, the Syrian government. Instead, they aligned with America. Now I
hear that a lot.
Yeah, right. It's not true. They tried their best to make an alliance with both and to play them off against each other. The Russians were the ones who stabbed them in the back first. The Americans are doing it now, which I found a little surprising. I thought the Russians would have more of a sense of sort of feudal honor, and more to prove about sticking with their allies. But no, they pulled the Russian observers out right before the Turkish invasion.
And that was that because of a Russian-Turkish deal involving...
There must have been
something
some
like
kind
that.
of deal. Well, we don't know. But it was also the Russians who apparently blocked the deal that the Afrin authorities were trying to negotiate with the Syrian government. The Syrian government came in and originally said, okay, we'll send in the Syrian army, and that way Turkey can't invade without starting an international war, but only on condition you give us political and interior security control. And of course, Afrin was like, no, you can't bring the secret police back. We'd literally rather die. But they said, all right, how about this? We'll have joint external security, and we keep internal security in our hands. The Syrian envoy said, okay, we'll take that back to Damascus and see what they said. It looked like, they didn't reject it out of hand, but apparently Iran and Russia nuked it. They're the ones who's, Iran has their own Kurdish minority and really didn't want to set a precedent. Russia presumably were concerned about ethnic minorities too. I'm not quite sure what their motivation was, but they're the ones who wouldn't allow it, and that's why Afrin essentially was thrown to the wolves.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense because the most logical thing here is the national self-interest of Assad.
Not to let another country occupy a piece of his own country.
Yeah, it's entirely in his rational self-interest. But on the other hand, the Iranians have sunk billions of dollars, not just militarily, but also in propping up the Syrian currency.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that makes sense. And also with the Russians, one of the crucial pillars of Russian domestic security policy, which bleeds into foreign policy, is basically the non-recognition of new nation states with Muslim majorities.
Yeah.
That's generally... Because you let that... you let that out of the box, and obviously on their southern border,
Chechnya,
yeah, that's not going to stop, and Dagestan, Ossetia, etc., etc. So that makes sense.
So let's go to two questions, I suppose. Why have the United States withdrawn their support now, and what will the consequences be?
Well, I think that essentially Erdogan was pushing and pushing and pushing, and he knew that America's fairly inconstant. Eventually, Trump has a tendency to listen to whoever the last person he talked on the phone with was. There's been endless negotiation going on. I'm not privy to the details of what was going on with the negotiations between the North Syria Democratic Confederation and the Assad regime. They were trying desperately to make some kind of arrangement. Their ultimate political goals, as I say, are to create a model for how Syria could operate and resolve the war. So it was entirely within their interest to do so. And you have to bear in mind that this is a movement that, to do this, to talk to the Syrian regime is really painful for them. When I was there, whenever you mention the regime, they would be, no, absolutely no, we cannot bring those guys back. Half of the PYD's original leadership are either dead or still in prison in Assad. No one knows. These guys have all had experience being tortured or brutalized, or fleeing in terror for the prospect of being so. They really don't like to have to do this. On the other hand, they have every intention of remaining within Syria. So I don't know what was going on with those negotiations. What seems to have happened was that Erdogan was demanding some sort of zone. I called it a safe zone, which is about as hypocritical a term as you could possibly imagine, considering it's essentially an ethnic cleansing zone. What he wanted was to take about 5 miles along the kilometer, clear it out of its actual inhabitants, and put in supplanted refugees that he no longer wanted to keep in Turkey. There was various negotiations going on. At least he wanted a buffer zone, in a military buffer zone, and it seemed like those negotiations had borne fruit. The Americans were guaranteeing some sort of joint patrol system in that area. Part of the demands that Turkey had made for that settlement was dismantling any defensive fortifications they had in the region along the border, which they did. But then almost as soon as they dismantled the defensive fortifications, America said, changing our mind, actually we're pulling out and allowing Turkey to invade. It seems that the reason why the Syrian regime went along with this is that Turkey assured them that they would basically clear out the SDF and then pull back to that 5 kilometer zone and let the Syrian government have the rest of the territory. Whether they will really do that is very dubious. If you look at what they're doing in Afrin, they're basically annexing the territory. They've set up schools to teach Turkish. They've ethnically cleansed most of the Kurdish inhabitants.
They're teaching Turkish.
They're teaching
in
Turkish.
Syrian territory.
Yes,
well,
they
legally
are.
Syrian territory.
Yes.
That's
And
crazy.
they've
And
announced
NATO members doing that.
a NATO member is doing
So you
this.
think about the analog here is like Crimea and Ukraine, right?
Oh yes, it's
So it's
so
like-
much more blatant than Crimea.
That's
and Ukraine.
crazy. Sort of like Russification of what's meant to be Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Right.
Well, they already spoke Russian
Right.
in
Well,
Crimea, didn't
no,
they?
but I know. But the claim is you've got you had various minorities,
Yeah.
which Tatars and so on, right? And they were going to be Russified, which basically this is what you're talking about with Afrin.
Except the numbers are in reverse. Crimea was about 95% Russia, whereas Afrin was about 95% Kurdish, and now it's no longer majority Kurdish. They've actually driven out most
And
of
so
the
what? And so what?
population.
So what? It's now there's being Turkish settlers going there. You're
Not
saying?
just Turkish. This is very interesting, and this is why they're being allowed to do this. What essentially they have done is they've driven out the indigenous population, and they've brought in refugees. And essentially, a lot of them are Arabs from other part of Syria, but they're basically the families of jihadis and hardcore Islamist militia people. What they've essentially said, we don't know how explicitly, but basically the message they've sent to Europe is, if you let us invade this territory, we'll take all those guys who you really don't want coming to Europe, and we'll resettle them there. So this is why this is a NATO power. This is a NATO army. I mean, their tanks are supplied by Germany. Their planes are supplied by the U.S. and the
It's
UK.
the second best funded army in NATO, right?
It is.
I
It's the
believe.
second largest and the second best funded. And the thing I always point out is it's not just, we sold them this stuff. We can't, be responsible for what they do of it. Modern weaponry needs to be maintained constantly. If you have a jet under combat conditions, you need to have it checked and fixed up, and replacement parts supplied pretty much every 2 or 3 days. That's repair and maintenance is not being done by Turks. That's being done by Italians, French people, Germans, British people, Americans, contractors. So this is a NATO army. This is essentially an imperialist army which has a military advantage which was entirely due to European and American support. Because, you have to bear in mind, the Turkish army is a mess. Half their good officers are still in jail since the coup. They have very little command control. They can't really use them reliably. Whenever they actually have a fair fight with another force which is equally well armed, they always lose. And they always will, because they have very little combat experience, and they're fighting guys who've got nothing but combat
Can you
experience.
explain something to me then?
Yes.
'Cause, obviously, Turkey is a NATO army. A lot of its hardware is coming from NATO members. So what's this relationship it has with Russia, whereby it buys pretty expensive kit from the Russians? Because
Well, it's starting to do so.
It seems to have a foot in both camps, so to speak.
Well,
Which is obviously
they're
relevant to this
successfully
conversation.
playing the game that the people in Rojava tried to do,
Yeah.
of balancing each off against each other. But it turned out that the Kurdish enclave in Syria was not strategically important enough to be able to get away with it, whereas Turkey is. But that's really important, that their army is nothing without the high-tech toys. And the high-tech toys are directly supplied and maintained by Europe and America. So this is why it's, insane to think of, the U.S. human shield sitting in Syria as an imperialist venture, but the NATO army is about to come in and actually commit ethnic cleansing on the local population, somehow aren't.
And so what's going to happen now? So America has all these toys, well, not America, sorry. Turkey has a very, high-tech military that's...
Yeah. They have their own military satellites.
I assume there's no one in Rojava that can compete remotely with this.
Well, that's also important, because despite the fact that the SDF was a military ally of the U.S. basically supplied them with small arms and armored vehicles. They did not supply them with anti-tank weapons or anti-aircraft weapons, which are, of course, the things which give Turkey a military advantage, the tanks and the aircraft.
Because they didn't want them to be an independent force.
Because they knew, and they didn't want because basically Turkey said no. We're a NATO power. You can't do this. Being a NATO power gives Turkey a lot of advantages that people don't acknowledge. One of the key ones politically is the fact that the PKK is internationally termed a terrorist organization. But, it's only termed a terrorist organization within NATO countries. The UN does not consider the PKK a terrorist organization because they're obviously not. They're a guerrilla army. Any country that isn't part of NATO, basically, I don't think there are any of them that consider the PKK a terrorist organization. So essentially, Turkey used its NATO connections to make the guerrilla force fighting it into something which wasn't even allowed to raise money or make a political statement in public legally anywhere in Europe or North America.
Even if you compare like the YPG, because what the YPG have is very effective to fight a defensive guerrilla war, but like you say, it's not something you'd associate with a standing army. Even the kit that's available to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which allegedly is provided by Iran, some of the stuff that they're able to do is far in excess of the Kurds in Syria. And like you say, they just haven't got a major. And actually, I think this feeds in more broadly to the criticism I would have of the political ideology that's behind it. We can talk about that perhaps in a second.
All right.
It's Michael's show. I don't want to force his hand, but I do think there's one of the problems, and we saw it in the mid-30s as well in Spain, with libertarian socialism and its limits, and obviously its theory of state power, which is a very powerful, compelling one, is that it doesn't really situate what's happening within the context of hegemonic nation states, regional powers, etc. And that there perhaps you've already sort of implied that's not the case with the Russian towers and Afrin.
Isn't the argument that they did actually try and do statecraft, but they just weren't?
They have an excellent diplomatic course.
They weren't strategically important enough for it actually to work.
So basically, you think that's a phony argument, doesn't stand up. Yeah. That it was it's sort of the intellectual foundations of this project politically always meant this was going to happen. You say that's not correct.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's not correct because these guys have been there, 7 years now? I mean, nobody's pulled that off. Think about the region they're in. Think about how many enemies they have. The fact that they're still there at all shows that, they are consummate diplomats.
And is the only hope now for, I suppose for the people that live there and for the movement that's going on, that Trump changes his mind, or that he's put under pressure from...
Trump has to be neutralized. I mean, it happened once before. It wasn't as bad last time. He had a phone call with Erdogan, and he was like, we'll just let them fight ISIS. And, the generals talked to him. The thing you have to bear in mind about the U.S. empire is that... a little like Nazi Germany, there were different forces, like to have, the SA versus the SS versus the Gestapo, having these different forces play off against each other. And in a way, American empire is not that different. The State Department, the CIA, the Pentagon, all have their own foreign policy. And one reason why in the early years of Trump, Rojava was doing relatively well was because Trump had something against state. He was basically trying to dismantle the State Department to a large degree. He would fill any political offices there. Also, he wasn't too fond of the CIA, who was, part of the whole Trump was allied with Russia movement, or at least a lot of people in it. But he loved the army. The army happened to be the one of those forces that was most fond of the SDF because they were working with them and had formed, the sort of sense of feudal honor and loyalty to people that they had been fighting alongside. And the State Department was always hardcore pro-Turkey and this sort of thing, and wanted to screw over Rojava as quickly as possible. The CIA has its own policies, but was more in that direction.
And the Pentagon's briefing that they're against what Trump's doing, right?
Yes,
the Pentagon's
exactly.
briefing that they want to keep supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces.
So if there's a chance of something happening, it's because a lot of army officers who are very angry about this, and even the ones who aren't, being sentimental, are simply saying, look, we've got to work with allies. If our last major ally gets ethnically cleansed and becomes a victim of genocide by us, basically the moment they finish the job, who's ever going to ally with us again? They've said that. Yeah.
But that's the story of U.S. alliances for 100 years.
Well, the army has never liked it.
No. But like, if you look at Iran, the Shah of Iran was the United States' best friend in the Middle East, right? People can talk about Israel being, the number one ally of the US in the region. It was formerly Iran, even above Israel until 1979. The guy had cancer. The United States wouldn't even take him in to be treated for cancer as he died because it would be too much for diplomatic overhead for them. There was too much downside, not enough upside. That's how the United States treats its friends. They would drop the Saudi royal family like a stone tomorrow if they could. So I find it strange that anybody would ever think that there would be some sort of code of honor coming out of the
military
US.
people are somewhat different than the politicians in that regard.
But they don't make the decisions ultimately.
Well, that's
right?
exactly right. But the weird thing about Trump is he loves military officers, and so if they're perversely enough, if there is a chance of a socialist revolution being saved, it's because Trump likes military officers.
How ironic.
The world is
in a way,
place.
it would make sense that they don't feel like they have to reward people who fought alongside them, because the whole story, it seems like, of Rojava is that they kind of knew that everyone was very likely to screw them over, but they didn't have any better options, right?
Yeah.
So no one...
They were looking around.
Yeah, no one was under false pretenses that America would be a reliable ally. It's just that you needed an ally with who could bomb your enemies.
Right.
So they didn't... I don't think they went into it with any illusions.
They didn't.
Maybe you disagree.
They didn't. I'm sure there were individuals who did, but I talked to people there, and they just considered the whole thing hilarious. There are these lifelong anti-imperialists. They're like, well, I guess we're working with the Americans now. See how long that lasts. What I think a lot of them are worried about at the moment is the attitude of Europe. And this is actually an interesting thing. A lot of the people I was talking to, both in Rojava and who are a part of the Kurdish diaspora in Europe now, actually think that what's going on now, and one reason that this is going to be allowed to happen, because it's not that often, that it's not just a NATO army that's coming in and invading another country, which is, extreme enough already, but it's invading another country with the expressed intention of committing war crimes. People who commit war crimes don't usually announce in advance that they're going to commit war crimes. And despite this, when they did it in Afrin and now here, without a peep, nobody said, wait a minute, you can't ethnically cleanse. Have you heard any major power say this? Well, what's going on?
Have they? Is there any?
Not to my knowledge.
Not a single. Not even the Swedes, the Norwegians.
Well, Corbyn made a statement.
Corbyn made a statement, but no sort of European head of state.
I'm sure there must be some. Occasionally, Merkel has said, "Oh, isn't this outrageous?" But while supplying them with tanks,
right?
There has been very little principled opposition because they just all pretend like, oh, well, we'll have to wait for the Amnesty International report to make sure that the numbers, he actually did do what he said he would do. So the fact that he announces in advance, yes, I will change the ethnic composition once I have conquered this place, doesn't seem to move them. He said, oh, just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. Seems to be the attitude. And one reason why this seems to be happening is, as I say, Erdogan keeps pointing out, I've got all these refugees that you really don't want in Europe. And he's gotten to the point, I actually don't know how he gets away with this stuff. He actually openly threatens European civilians all the time. There was one speech where he actually said, if you continue to do something he didn't like, Europeans will not be safe to walk the streets. And
Because he'll release all the terrorists and all of ISIS into Europe.
Yeah. So I've actually heard people in the Kurdish diaspora in Rojava saying, well, I guess they decided they'd rather have us as refugees than the Islamists. If you send a bunch of displaced Kurdish leftists into Cologne or Berlin or, all the various, London for that matter, well, at least they're not going to blow anybody up, they'll blockade bridges or something, but there'll be a nice sort of relatively civilized, educated population.
But now there would be
feminist principles.
No, but there is a justifiable point, which is that 30, 40 years ago, that political tendency was much closer to the Red Army faction or the Red Brigades than where they presently are. So the idea that these are the nice, fluffy leftists and there is a history to the PKK, and so obviously I don't think it's I think it's a national liberation struggle. I think the PKK are entirely legitimate, but there is a history there. It seems we shouldn't evade that, surely.
But what I'm saying is, I think what the Europeans are saying is, yeah, they're not going to do that now, and it's not like letting ISIS guys here. You know, if I had a choice between having like ISIS adherents and PKK adherents living down the street from me, I'll take the PKK guys anytime.
Yeah.
So in a way, they're victims of their own sort of internal reforms. You know, they're no longer vicious, scary guys. So, well, why not kick them out of their homes and let them come to Europe? Right. We'll have a higher quality of refugee.
We're going to move on to Extinction Rebellion. If you have any questions about what's going on in Rojava, save them for the end. We take audience questions at the end of the show,
Okay.
But first of all, actually, before we go on to Extinction Rebellion, you are watching Tiski Sour. You're watching Novara Media. As you know, this is only possible because of your kind support. You demonstrated that very well over the last 2 weeks. And now we go back to our usual request, which is the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, so we can continue working around the clock, hopefully get some full-time people soon. So please go to support.novaramedia.com. Like this video, keep your comments coming, share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook. This week is the start of Extinction Rebellion's Autumn Rebellion, or Autumn Uprising. That was... so I suppose that started yesterday. We're blocking Lambeth and Westminster bridges, occupying Whitehall, lots of people with tents up. It all went better than there was a bit of a botched effort last week to spray red paint on the Treasury, and they sort of lost control of the hose. It was all very funny. But what's happened since then has been much more functional. So I want to start with a discussion of I think probably their most controversial and newsworthy action from yesterday, which was their occupation of Smithfield Market. I don't think we're going to watch a video, but you'll see some images of that coming up. So I wanted to know what you guys thought about that tactic of occupying Smithfield Market and filling it with vegetable stalls. It was, I suppose it was somewhat controversial because people thought it got in the way of the livelihoods of traders, etc. So it was seen as not having class analysis. But at the same time, we do need to stop eating so much meat.
I mean,
you go first.
Yeah. So the thing, here we go. The video's up now. The thing is, agricultural processes, how we feed ourselves as a planet, 7.5 billion people, all the milk, cheese, meat we consume. Already we're living over the planet's biocapacity. We basically consume the resource of 1.6 planets. That's with potentially demand for all this stuff doubling in the next 35 years, because partially of population increase by about 2.5 billion, but also because the global south, justifiably, want to eat the kind of diet that we have in the global north. But the point is, we can't do that. The planet literally can't do that. And so we clearly need to change consumption patterns around food. And I think where the left is kind of lagging, I don't think that's particularly good action personally, but I can understand the importance of making that statement politically, because everybody talks about hydrocarbons, we need to decarbonise by 2030. Nobody really talks about how much water, land is being used in meat production, how much, the relationship between agribusiness, agri-entrepreneurs, quote unquote, agricultural elites in Brazil and what's going on in the Amazon, that kind of thing. So I think that's a lacuna on the debate, which hopefully at least this will elevate to a point.
But given all that, you still don't think it was a good action? You think that the downsides override the
No,
upsides?
I don't. But look, personally, I think it could have been more propositional. And the thing is, the power of, it's like Rome.
What does that mean?
Rome wasn't built in a day. With the Green New Deal, for instance, people who work in petrochemical and sort of engineering, or oil rig workers, these are good, well-paid union jobs. You say to them, look, we want you to be able to work in a similar sector in the future with great unionised jobs, same salaries, etc., etc. That message isn't going to these workers at Smithfield. Now,
what would the message? You can trade vegetables instead of meat would be.
Well, this is it. It's very easy to point to hydrocarbons and big oil and say you're scumbags. You've got all these oligarchs. It's very, very, by virtue of the fixed capital required to get this stuff out of the ground and to get gas and oil to distribute it to millions of people. It has oligarchs, it has billionaires, it has some of the most valuable companies in the world. Meat is a global $1 trillion industry, but it doesn't have BP, it doesn't have Shell, it doesn't have these big CEOs. It is going to be the mum and dad operation at Smithfield's at Smithfield's Market. It is going to be the local butcher. These will be the people that could potentially be put out of a business. One sec. If we do change consumption habits to the level we have to, and so I partially sympathise with them, because, for instance, I don't think abattoirs should exist. I think the way that we kill animals for modern meat is outrageous. It's disgusting. It's unethical. but also it's part of a wider system which is destroying the planet. And somebody say, well, these are good jobs. Well, being a bailiff's a good fucking job. It pays your wages. You could be a unionised bailiff. We still shouldn't have them, you know. So being a mercenary is a quote-unquote good job. You probably get quite a lot of money for it. So, you know, we have to have a conversation on the left about how do we address this issue of meat consumption. Clearly, it has to be massively reduced. How do we do that? In two ways, which are really important. Firstly, by not telling the global south they don't deserve the quality of life that we expect and anticipate in the global north. Secondly, how can we speak to workers in the global north as well who would be adversely affected by any transition away from contemporary animal agricultural practices?
I'm kind of sympathetic to the whole, because I think actually the analogy with hydrocarbons is much closer than you make it out to be, because there's the same thing with when it comes to, you know, the airlines or the people who are getting the oil out of the ground. And there was a big critique of Extinction Rebellion at the beginning that they didn't go after the people who were financing fossil fuel extraction. They went after consumption, or they went to the middle of the city. But I actually think it proved to be a more effective tactic, because it's by going on a bridge that you get huge public engagement, huge public awareness of what you're doing. Whereas if you go to after the business, then it's only the BP staff that notice.
I know, I'm going to, because this is naughty of me to come back to.
It's the same with meat, right? Which they could have gone to the abattoir, but if they'd gone to the abattoir, no one would have noticed. They had to go to Smithfield.
I wasn't suggesting that. I'm suggesting there is no similar enemy. So James Meadway put this very well. You know, in contemporary politics, in this era of populism, you need an enemy. You know, these are the bad people over here. What we're seeing right now in Mike Ashley and Jeremy Corbyn, for instance. It's much easier to do that with oil, right? Because literally some of the world's largest companies by market capitalization are fossil fuel companies. It's much easier. Somebody said in the comments, Monsanto. Firstly, Monsanto isn't really that big compared to some of these companies. Secondly, it's not...
Doesn't do meat, does it?
It doesn't do meat.
Just genetically modified seeds.
Right. So, you know, it's a very different political terrain. And also it's more of an ethical terrain, right? There is also the issue of animal rights and suffering, unnecessary suffering, which is less, not entirely missing, but less of an issue when it comes to fossil fuels.
David, we've given you a lot of time now to...
Go on.
We've gone on there. We've gone on there. What do you think about the Extinction Rebellion's sort of latest iteration? And especially sort of coming onto that occupying of Smithfield's meat market.
Well, when it comes to things like meat, I mean, I'm a little hesitant about the danger of making consumer practice the primary focus, because it's you have to fight against the stream, because that's essentially what everyone wants you to do. There's a sort of neoliberal environmentalism, Macronism, if you like, which essentially is willing to save the earth, but is only willing to do it on the backs of the poor. And if you give those guys any opening, they will pursue it, because that's where all the weight is going to go. So you don't want to back that up. You want to swim against that current as much as you can, because the current's going to be there whether you like it or not. And the political implications of too much of a focus on consumerism are disturbing, to say the least, unless you have a very explicit sort of libertarian, socialist, anti-state perspective. I've heard people talk about rationing, for example. You know, the need to actually talk seriously about rationing of different meat, of consumer goods, of energy, so forth and so on, with remarkably little reflection on how that would be democratized, if indeed it would.
So where have you heard that? Where is that a dominant strain in Extinction Rebellion?
I don't think it's a dominant strain, but I think it's a kind of a default instinct that people will fall back on if you don't have a counter discourse, if you don't have an alternative proposal. That's where it'll go. And I've heard Extinction Rebellion people say, well, maybe you're right, because they don't have a strong discourse about why that would be objectionable. I mean, I've been trying to come up with my own ideas. I'm involved in this because I'm involved with the Extinction Rebellion Brain Trust. I don't know if you know about this.
I didn't know about that, no.
Yeah, they asked some of us to put together a group of heterodox economists who could come up with a model for how it would be feasible to get to carbon neutrality by 2025. And it's partly just to show that it could be done, and it's partly to give the citizens' assemblies, they want to convene something to work with. And there's a lot of different ways you could do it. So the citizens' assemblies would still have something to do. But one of the things that we noticed quite early on is that, there's a huge pressure to sort of turn this into another version of austerity, which I think personally would be disastrous. People have had enough of, oh no, for the sake of your grandchildren, you all have to stop making do of less and you all have to suffer. I mean, they've been told this for 10, 20 years, and it's never true. And in fact, the result was like life for their grandchildren is likely to be even worse. So people are, not only skeptical of this, they have every reason to be skeptical of it. Some sort of centralized authority giving them this yet again round of sacrifice logic. However, it's not clear how much of that sacrifice would really be necessary. Sure, travel, meat, we'd have to cut down on that a little. But it's also true that, if you look at the major contributors to increased energy use, which is indeed increasing all the time, what I call bullshit jobs is actually a really big one.
Bitcoin mining.
Yeah, if 35% of people are just sitting there doing nothing all day, think about all the energy that takes. Think about all the buildings, what it takes to keep those buildings heated and supplied. At the same time, and this is something nobody talks about, I like to compliment bullshit jobs with batshit construction projects. It's amazing how much unnecessary building is going on in the world. If you look at material throughput, as Jason Hickel likes to put it, I'm working on something with him on this topic. The total amount of stuff that's being produced every year keeps going up, and often quite dramatically. Economists are quite confused by this because it shouldn't be happening. Economic growth rates in rich countries are not very high, and they keep arguing that the economy is shifting to service and information economy, so the amount of material things should be going down. But it's not. And if you look at why this is happening, it turns out it's all infrastructure. There's enormous amounts of investment in new housing developments, new office blocks, airports. I mean, it's sort of like China was doing it, to do catch up for a while. India was doing it. But, once they filled up, they just kept going. So
what are you defining as just because often on Novara Media we talk about how we need a strong socialist state to be investing in new housing and investing in quite a lot of new infrastructure.
Well, there's stuff that people actually need, but this is not actually going to... I mean, there are airports. There's quite a number of airports that have been built now that no plane has ever landed on.
In the United Kingdom?
No. But in Spain, that's happening. In East Asia, that's happening a lot. To give an example, and actually this is another element in the argument, I can't do the whole thing, but I've been trying to construct this kind of 18th Brumaire analysis of what are the major dynamic sectors of capital right now and what sort of political tendencies are they supporting. And the conclusion I made is that, it's my initial conclusion, is that essentially you have two formations. You have finance, which is kind of allied to the professional managerial classes and the interests those represent. And those guys are the neoliberals. They're willing to save the planet, but only on the backs of the poor. And then you have not only the extractive industries, which we all know about, but construction and real estate. In a way, I think that the election in America between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump represented the divorce of finance and real estate, who before 2008 had made this kind of devil's alliance, fell apart again. Now construction everywhere seems to be backing the populist right. Trump himself is a construction real estate guy. But if you look at it, Putin's party, he was really founded by Mayor Lushkov in Russia, who was famous for putting up these giant blocks of office towers. And there was, before they had any idea what to put in them. And then they have to make up the bullshit jobs. Modi's doing this kind of thing all over India. Erdogan is doing this kind of thing all over Turkey. Ahmadinejad.
The Shard locally, right, in London, the sort of vacancy rates in the Shard were just astronomical. The Qataris built it basically as an asset which they project over 30 years would give them certain amounts of revenues, certain amounts of prestige with the British government. But they didn't really, and even now occupancy is quite low. I'm not quite sure what it is, but occupancy was very, very low for a very long time. So
the model for that was the Twin Towers. It took them about 30 years to fill it up.
Wow.
Yeah. It only just really got to fill it when it blew up.
God.
Yeah.
I want to know your opinion on the one thing that I suppose on left Twitter is the most debated element, I think, of Extinction Rebellion. As someone who has sort of written about street movements for years and years, their relationship to the police.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, what they did worked the first time around. the question is what's going to happen now that the police are being told to clamp down. I mean, look, every street movement has to adopt a position on this sort of thing. And I think while they went a bit far, it made a certain amount of sense to take the extreme nonviolent position at that particular historical moment. It's not sustainable over the long term. The danger of taking a too conciliatory relation with the police, of course, is that you end up becoming an extension of the police. So, you have to set up very, very clear buffers between your own marshals and the cops, or the cops will just turn them into their own adjuncts. But even more, you have to create your own internal police to enforce these kind of pure nonviolence, no harsh language kind of standards. And there is a certain point where you have to make a decision between internal solidarity and looking nice in the eyes of the media, who are going to start representing you as a bunch of savages anyway, no matter what happens.
It's interesting that point, like seeing a distinction between internal solidarity or being conciliatory towards the police, because I suppose what they'd argue is that actually the majority of people within that movement, or the vast majority of people within that movement, want to take a conciliatory attitude, and so they're just enforcing basically the majority opinion. And if someone goes there and shouts "fuck the police," the majority of people will be like, no, that's not how we do things. What's unsustainable about it, I suppose, is the question. Because for me, it seems like it's still working quite well.
Yes, what's unsustainable is when the police decide it's unsustainable. The police, how the police feel about you is kind of irrelevant, unless you're really talking endgame, and they send in the army to kill people, and they have to decide whether they're going to do it or not. But, until it gets to that point, the police just do what they're told. So their personal attitudes is really irrelevant. The question is, when they decide to crack down, what do you do? Which they will do once they perceive you as a sufficient threat. Actually, people in Extinction Rebellion expected the cops were going to come down a lot heavier than they did this time around. The cops were pursuing kind of a clever approach. You know what they've been doing? They've been basically going straight after the bathrooms. They've been going after toilet facilities and food facilities, so as to make it extremely
difficult. Took me a while
difficult
to understand what you meant, but I thought they were arresting people in the bathrooms.
No,
but you're saying they go
They're
after
arresting the bathrooms themselves.
Yeah. Because that makes it unsustainable to stay in that place for a long period of time.
Right. So they're being more oppressive, but they're doing it in a relatively clever and indirect fashion. How long that will be the case, that's a very interesting question. I mean, if you're talking about the basic strategy of nonviolent direct action, there's three factors. There's the media coverage. There's, whoever is giving the police the orders and what strategy the police take, and then there's your own tactics. What the police themselves feel, as I say, doesn't really matter until they order really violent repression. And that's always the end game. When you win, it's when they send people to shoot you, and the guys they send to shoot you don't do it. But that's pretty far in the future in this case.
So what are the immediate problems? Because that's obviously, things aren't going to escalate like that in the foreseeable future.
Right. The immediate problem is image. They're fighting a battle of images. Because, for example, in America, Gandhian tactics just don't work. Because in order for the idea of a Gandhian tactics is you make it clear that you're going to be totally nonviolent no matter what happens. And then people get to witness just how vicious the state will be to suppress people who clearly would never hurt anybody. And that creates a kind of a moral crisis, and it brings out the essentially repressive nature of the state. That's the basic idea. That only works if the media reports it that way. A problem you have in the U.S., for example, is the U.S. media simply... They can talk about rogue cops. They can even talk about a small group of cops as engaged in violent activity. But nothing done by, say, 100 cops under order could possibly be violent or ever be described as such. The best they could possibly do if cops are just openly torturing people in the street, as they did during the old growth forest protests, where they were just rubbing pepper sprays in the eyes of people in lockdown. The most they could do is have a kind of point counterpoint. Nonviolent activists are being tortured. Is that okay? Well, on the left, someone who says, no. On the right.
Is the counterpoint not to that, though, that because of social media, etc., not only could you put the police in moral crisis, but you could put the mainstream media in moral crisis if there are people on Twitter or on Facebook, seeing that there's an incredibly peaceful group of protesters who are getting tortured by the police in the street.
That's the interesting thing, and that might be a good practical demonstration of whether social media has become as hegemonic as some people seem to think. If people are getting most of their information from social media, the question is how much of that information they're getting from social media is news information that's recycled through social media, and how much of it is actually coming from independent sources. It would be interesting to see whether we can get to the point that we can get beyond the sort of news spin of BBC and Murdoch. But at this point, the media seems to be playing along with the nonviolent angle. I mean, it's an interesting historical moment, perhaps due to the nature of the issue, the nature of the protests. I haven't seen it in a very long time, that we've seen such a massive movement, both acting nonviolently and actually portrayed as being nonviolent.
I mean, I find the way the BBC reports on this stuff just bizarre. I was watching a report on Hong Kong protests yesterday, and they were talking about violent protesters. And you think they're dealing with the Chinese state apparatus, or an adjunct to the Chinese state apparatus. Like what China does in Tibet, what it does in, Xinjiang is like really, really violent. These people are like, throwing smoke bombs back at the cops. And it's just...
You've got tanky lefties on Twitter doing the same, though.
What's that?
Doing what?
Tanky lefties sort of saying it's the Hong Kong protesters that are the violent ones.
I'm sure there's some
right,
bad. I'm
because
sure there's some
they're all
bad people
American
there or whatever. But I
agents
mean,
and so forth,
ultimately, Hong Kong right now is an outlier in terms of the respect given towards civil liberties, etc. In a way that it's not true in China.
Although it's also true. This is an interesting thing about China. I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, the Chinese interior minister actually let slip that there had been, I can't remember the exact number, it was something like 35,732 unauthorized incidents, by which he meant riots. It turns out, violent acts with more than 15 people involved. That's insane. I mean, it shows something about China, not only that they had that many, but that they had people tabulating them all.
Oh, no. We talked about it at great length in previous years. There was a real hot period, about 2010 to 2015, like you say, of riots, of strikes,
Chinese models of repression just are very unfamiliar to us because they don't follow the same logic we're used to. Certain things you can get away with that you just couldn't possibly get away with in other places, and other things they just come down like a ton of bricks immediately. I remember actually, it's stuck in my head because I'd actually landed at Beijing airport and I'd flown through China I was in a tour in East Asia at the time. And I just remember just how incredibly efficient it was. They would come at exactly the right moment. Everything was perfectly timed. And I got back to America, and, if the plane was only 20 minutes late, they seemed proud of themselves. There were missed connections. Everything was a disaster. Total chaos all the time. And I was like, so what's going on? Are they just like more efficient? Is this a rising power and we're a declining power? And then I read a little article in the newspaper that said, Chinese airline passengers riot, destroy computers over missed connection.
wow.
And I said, I see, we're sheep. I mean, they just don't take things lying down. There is a tradition. They were just sitting there smashing one computer every hour until they had proper accommodation. And this is considered totally normal in China.
Consumer power.
Yeah.
All right,
Red Guards.
Final story, and then we'll briefly go to questions. This is Jeremy Corbyn and Mike Ashley's flame war. I didn't tell you we were going to be talking about this, so don't worry if you don't.
I don't know anything
have
about
a hot
this.
take about Jeremy Corbyn and Mike Ashley's flame war. But this weekend, Jeremy Corbyn tweeted a video of him talking to a group of disgruntled Newcastle United fans, where he explicitly called out Newcastle United owner Mike Ashley. That's the owner of Sports Direct. Hopefully, we can get that video up now.
I've 27 years, 2 season tickets, and I've given up because my money is going directly into his pocket. It is not going towards the betterment of my football club.
For me, it's advertising hoardings for Sports Direct, nothing more. The identity's been completely lost, and I think as a group of fans we'd probably agree that we want our identity back.
If Newcastle United does badly, my fellow citizens do badly.
A small group of people are ruining our national game. Billionaire football owners like Mike Ashley, who runs Newcastle United Football Club. I've been meeting Newcastle fans who are trying to take back control of their club. Football is more than just a game. It's more than just a club. It's an institution rooted in the social fabric of our communities. They're too important to be left in the hands of bad owners who put their business interests ahead of everything else, marginalise supporters and even rip them off. Sport must be run for those who follow it, those who love it, not for a wealthy few. Under Labour, things will be different. We'll review the failing system of football governance, ensure supporters have a say in how their clubs are run, and make sure the multi-billion pound Premier League TV deals are invested in grassroots football. We'll put football clubs back where they belong, at the heart of our communities. Let's make sure the beautiful game is run in the interests of the people, not the billionaire owners.
Down. So today the club has published a statement in response. It states that financially, other than sums provided to the club on a short-term interest-free basis and repaid to him as intended, we would like to make it clear that Mike Ashley has not taken a penny out of Newcastle United in interest, salary or dividend, as is customary at many clubs. Aaron, who's right here?
Jeremy Corbyn's right. The stadium was literally called the Sports Direct Arena. I can't remember what it was. You know, all the awnings like the fan talks about is Sports Direct. It's basically a way of just getting Sports Direct branding out to the world. And you have to understand that the Premier League is watched. It's beamed into more than 4 billion households worldwide.
Wow.
So it makes Sports Direct, you know, a global brand. So not really. And also, Ashley bought the club on the cheap. He's not invested anything into it, and he's now sitting on an asset worth a lot more than what he bought it for. And the fans aren't happy with him. They want him to leave. He won't leave because, as I've said, he gets this fantastic deal basically on free advertising for Sports Direct. He's certainly not in it for the football. They've been relegated twice under his ownership. They've really gone nowhere as a club. They've got no identity. And like I said, he sort of sold the soul of the club. Wonga, the payday lender, was formerly the shirt sponsor.
Oh, that's terrible.
You know, I know. It was Wonga. And then this year it was replaced by like Online 888, which is like a Chinese online betting company. So it's like if you're a Newcastle fan, it's just
How sleazy can
it's
you
horrific.
get?
Yeah, it's like the ultimate sleazy club. So the idea that he's like some sort of, you know, patrician kind benefactor is complete bullshit. It's like the sleaziest club in the Premier League now because of Mike Ashley.
We'll see if Mike Ashley has a response, because the statement did go on. So he goes on to say, we agree with, or Newcastle United go on to say, we agree with Mr. Corbyn that a football club is more than just a club. It is an institution at the heart of our communities. That is why our vast work across the local community will continue, with Newcastle United Foundation providing services and support to tens of thousands of people in our region each year who truly need them. Often, Newcastle United Foundation's projects fill in significant gaps that the public sector sadly cannot stretch to. Implicit critique of austerity there, particularly at a time when government cuts are so prevalent. Oh, it was a real critique of austerity. Interesting. Maybe they're Labour people. In any case, this second part of the statement you said was a joke before the show.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because Newcastle United they don't pay a living wage to their staff. There's in the Premier League, there's 20 clubs. Four of the 20 clubs in the Premier League, these are some of the most valuable sports businesses in the world. Manchester United is valued between 3 and 4 billion pounds. They don't pay a living wage to their staff. Mike Ashley, owner of Sports Direct, you know, the horror stories about how he treats his staff are legion. You know, in-work poverty is the norm for somebody working at Sports Direct. In their warehouses, there's stories of women giving birth while at work. Ambulances repeatedly going to Sports Direct warehouses. He was called to task for this, actually, and when he was speaking to a parliamentary committee on the matter.
He's like the Amazon of sport.
It's exactly it's the Amazon of sport. So if your business model is in-work poverty, if the football club you own, which by the way I think this year is the 20th most valuable in Europe, even now, Newcastle, because it has such a loyal fan base. There's the TV rights, there's also obviously the match day ticket sales. All of that money, all those revenues, and you still can't pay a living wage to your staff, and you have the temerity to say that you contribute to the local community and you make up for gaps because of austerity. Mike Ashley and his business model is austerity. That's why we've got 8 million people in households in this country where somebody is working and they're in poverty. It's because of people like Mike Ashley. It's the idea that he is the solution, or Newcastle United's projects are the solution. No, Mike Ashley, you are the problem. You are very much the epitome of what is wrong with the British economy. Piss off.
Do you agree? I thought you were going to come back with a huge defense of Mike Ashley there, but probably we can't expect that now, can we?
No.
Some questions. If you have some audience questions, please now put them in the comments, and I will put them to David and Aaron. While you're doing that, again, you're watching Tisky Sour, you're watching Navarro Media. As you know, this is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a supporter to Navarro Media, thank you very much. If not, please go to support.navarromedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Also, make sure you are subscribed to the Cortado, which is Navarro Media's weekly newsletter written by Ash Sarkar herself. It is always hilarious, very much worth getting, so sign up to that. Now, let's see, put your questions in the comments. Right.
I love these like little Twitter tanks. Bunch of white people that don't know what's going on. Like Bastani, where do you think that's from?
Who said this? On Twitter or in our comments?
Well, no, it's just in the YouTube comments. I mean, I'm only half Iranian, I guess. And Iranians, we're the ones in the Middle East that we aren't really brown. We just tan quite well. So I'll take that.
Speaking into European language.
Oh,
That's true. That's true.
Said it Kurds. So.
This question is challenging the revolutionariness of what's going on in Rojava. So Thomas Muir asks, has there been a social revolution in Rojava given private enterprises and large-scale land holdings still remain the property of former owners? And there's actually a reference, Schmidinger, 2018. Is this just anarchism confined to showpieces?
No, actually, it is definitely the case that there has been redistribution of land. I mean, some of that had already been accomplished under the Ba'ath regime, and some of the reprivatization was de facto. It was a sort of crony capitalist thing. Those guys all fled. I was told that, the old great landlords now find it almost impossible. Some of them do have more land than other people. They can't get labor because everyone has their own plots at this point, and enough land has been redistributed that essentially, they're forced to give up a lot of their lands just because they can't get anybody to work it. There's no dependent labor force, and there's nobody desperate enough to work for them. So there hasn't been a cooperatization of the entire economy. In fact, people have said that cooperatization is one of the least advanced aspects of the revolution, but it's also true that there are no large enterprises. It's not like there are private factories in this part of Syria. Insofar as there are large workshops and factories, they are socially owned and collectives rather than privately owned. But most of the economy is, independent craftsmen, independent merchants. It's a small scale, sort of petty bourgeois, traditional mercantile stuff.
This is a really interesting question that I'm going to put to both of you. Daniel Eden, does the left need to reevaluate its gut reaction to Western intervention in the Middle East? The socialist Kurds have clearly benefited from Western interventionism.
Yes and no. I mean, that came from a particular situation. I don't think that anybody wants the U.S. military to remain in the Middle East. I certainly don't. I don't know any Kurdish people in the region or within the Kurdish movement who say, yeah, we want the Americans to stay. I mean, maybe they want them to stay 6 months to a year. But what people really want is to be able to get anti-air and anti-tank weapons to defend themselves, and then they don't need those guys around. As it happens, there's a play of imperial forces going on, and the Americans at this point, it's a declining power. They're just one of many forces. There's Russia, there's Iran, there's the Gulf states who all have their own sort of separate foreign policy initiatives going on. You have Turkey. Israel's doing various things. There are any number of different imperial and semi-imperial powers pursuing different agendas, and NATO being one of them. Now, it would be nice if all of them clear out. There might be certain occasions when, owing to the play of forces, one of those imperial powers, which actually is the one which comes from most far away and at least obviously belongs in the region, might happen to play a role saving a socialist revolution. But that idea that validates their being there in the first place, I don't agree at all.
But it validates their staying there, presumably. What should be the left's demand here? Because presumably we still want America in this situation as it currently exists to be giving.
If it were me, I would call for a
defense.
no-fly zone. I mean, Turkish air power is completely supplied by Western powers. Western powers could easily take that away. If they declared a no-fly zone over Rojava and allowed the SDF to acquire anti-tank and anti-air weapons to defend themselves, I don't think that any American troops would be helpful at all.
And if there is a no-fly zone over Rojava, so one demand that I suppose the left was quite resistant to was the idea of a no-fly zone across the whole of Syria.
Well, that's because it would be an imperial violation of the sovereignty of the Syrian government. I don't think the Syrian government would necessarily mind the imposition of a no-fly zone against people not from Syria coming in.
Aaron?
Yes, really strange one, isn't it? But at the same time, David's right. We're already selling weapons to one side. So the idea that non-intervention should just mean, the non-intervention of military forces. I mean, it obviously has to be expanded as well to what economic support are you giving to one side, what military support, logistical support. For instance, in the Yemen war, we're doing precisely that with the Saudis. So, yeah, we don't have boots on the ground. We probably do, to be honest. We don't have regular armed forces on the ground. But we're still very much involved in that conflict. Personally speaking, I would never want to see British armed forces anywhere in the Middle East whatsoever. But, like you say, with regards to weapons, logistical support of some kind, I can see how it can have its merits. And under a Corbyn government, this is something which we've lagged on the left, because obviously the left's not been in power in many of these countries for a long time. And it's been one of sort of oppositional politics. Who would we want Britain's allies to be in the Middle East in the event of a socialist government? And it's a really important question. How do we relate to Iran? Now, I would like to see the Iran deal, for instance, brought back on the table. I would like to see an end to sanctions. At the same time, Britain has to engage with the reality of how Iran treats its LGBT community, how it treats Kurds, etc. So I think, we're going to have a really sophisticated debate around foreign policy more generally, obviously because the Middle East has been a crucible of foreign policy fuck-ups for more than a century, particularly relevant there.
I mean, if you look at what's going on in the Middle East, one of the things that really strikes me is that the way European racism toward the Middle East operates it's a little counterintuitive. I mean, I think if you look at the alignment you have with the Turkish army, essentially for foot soldiers, they're not using Turkish troops. They're using Arab jihadis. They're using, often supposedly former ISIS guys, former Al-Qaeda guys. I mean, and then, they have the Turkish army backing that up. And then you have these Americans, Germans, British people, operating the machinery from behind the scenes backing up the Turkish army. So there's a three times removed. But ultimately that means that, you have Americans and Brits who are sitting there, ultimately running an army whose foot soldiers are ISIS guys. How the hell did that happen? And I think essentially, these people have decided that, well, that's all you can expect from the Middle East. These guys are a bunch of savages. They're all a bunch of crazy Islamists. Oh, well, rather than seeing the people who seem to have the same values you do, that are feminists, that are ecologists, that believe in some direct democracy, who basically believe in the values Europeans largely falsely profess to believe in and actually take them seriously as being some kind of allies, you actually hear European diplomats saying, well, it's just going to cause like more violence and terrorism because they're going to shake things up. Traditionals are going to get angry. There seems to be this idea that these are a bunch of savages. You can't expect this in them to act like civilized people like us. If even the suggestion starts, it'll probably make things worse. And thus you end up with preferring ISIS as an ally to a group of ecofeminists. I mean, which is essentially what's happening right now.
John W. What possible route to statehood is there for the Kurds in the long term, if it exists at all?
Well,
I mean, you've already talked about how you've complicated the idea that what they want is statehood.
They don't want a state. They explicitly say it all the time.
Democratic confederalism.
Yeah.
Is there any? I suppose you've talked about that they want democratic confederalism.
Yes.
Is there any route to getting it? And what would it be?
It's just, they've got to be just as patient as Erdogan. The reason Erdogan got to his point where he's poised to invade is he was utterly single-minded. He knew what he wanted, and he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And essentially that's what the Kurdish movement is doing as well. There's a very large territory, and any time they have an opportunity to start developing a democratic confederalist model, they do. I mean, there's like parts of Iraq now where those kind of models are taking off. It was started by Kurdish refugees, but it's becoming very popular. People see it works. People see that it creates a kind of a feeling of community that doesn't exist elsewhere. And the Iraqi Kurdish government is becoming quite worried about sort of young people kind of going over to that sort of thing. The HDP was doing it you have to admire the patience. They keep coming out. A generation gets arrested, tortured, people killed, and it's another one comes in 5 years and keeps at it and keeps at it and keeps at it. Eventually, it's going to work.
David, we're going to move on to Extinction Rebellion now.
Thing?
Yeah, go on.
Also, the diaspora. If young Turkish people today become the politicians, the influencers, the journalists of tomorrow in Germany, France, the United States, the UK, people talk about the Israel lobby, and it becomes this thing. If you mention it, the reality is there is a funded set of organisations in Washington very good at helping influence US foreign policy in the region. Nothing wrong with that. That's what you should try and do as a nation state. So I suppose it's a bit about Kurdish agency. It's also about, how do you shape the policy decisions of countries in the global north? Kurdistan is not going to find any allies in the Middle East for the reasons that David's talked about, because 4 countries are affected by any potential, insurgent sort of separatist sentiment. However, it could be very different if you have, if a Labour government has 4 or 5 Kurdish MPs and they have a powerful caucus in Parliament, and there are powerful Kurdish business people and a powerful Kurdish lobby in terms of shaping British foreign policy, that's where you could probably see something change.
And the idea of democratic confederalism also, one of the most interesting things I've seen is that a lot of people involved in the Kurdish movement have been talking to people in other movements and saying, well, have you thought about this as a solution to problems which seem intractable otherwise? For example, there's starting to be a lot of Palestinians and people on either side of the Israeli-Palestinian line saying, well, we've talked about 2-state, we've talked about 1-state. Democratic confederalism might actually work as a way of resolving some of this stuff.
That's, to be honest, Palestine's an example of where you have got a very effective external lobbying movement for that nation state. And to be honest, it's been a limited strategy, because when you... I suppose they're just...
They're up against
overwhelming force. And they're up against actually, a movement that's doing a similar thing even more effectively.
With the state helping it as well, right?
Yeah. And has been doing it for a lot longer. Yeah. Palestinians are simply a more recent diaspora.
Yeah. There's a question about Extinction Rebellion. David P4F Newcastle.
Oh, hello.
But it's not about Newcastle. What's the point of Extinction Rebellion now that Labour have backed a Green New Deal?
Well, there's one thing to back it, and there's another thing to actually do something about it. And Extinction Rebellion isn't just saying we want Labour to endorse this and win the election. They want to change the entire political discourse so that nobody can avoid it. Even if the Tories end up there, they will be forced to do something.
Aaron?
Yeah, that's entirely right. You need to just refashion the political common sense around the issue so that it's not... We don't want climate change to be a part of the political issue. Obviously, I want Labour to implement the Green New Deal, but it should just be the default for every political party. If you don't do it, you're unelectable. Yeah. And that's what, exile's for.
Yeah. My argument's always the same. So whenever you go... It's interesting, actually, you're talking about the consumer choice. What the right-wing shock jocks are always trying to do is say, these people want you to have no meat, no cars, no food, no holidays by 2025, and they sort of construe the stuff in their... Have they got a manifesto or in their statement of principles on the website or whatever? Right. And I always say, look, I think the solution to climate change is Labour's Green New Deal, because I'm often going on there defending Labour policy. But the reason I have so much respect for Extinction Rebellion and why I support what they do, even though I don't necessarily subscribe to all of the demands, is because they have been remarkably effective at putting this issue onto the top of the agenda and making sure that when people vote at the next election, they will keep climate change in their minds. So I don't think you need to see Labour's Green New Deal and Extinction Rebellion in conflict with one another.
Not at all.
Which, to be honest, neither did the Labour leadership, because John McDonnell had a big section in his Labour conference speech where he sort of got everyone to give a round of applause to Extinction Rebellion and the
I
climate
know that.
movement, because he said they made the space for us too.
And that is in
Deliver
fact the
these
Labour
dramatic
strategy.
policies.
I mean, we have to bear. I'm an anarchist, right? I'm not someone who's going to join a political party. But the reason I respect the people who are now guiding the direction of the Labour Party, people like John McDonnell, is because they don't want to co-opt the extra parliamentary left. They understand that the only way we're ever going to get anywhere is between a synergy with people working within the system and people working outside it. So having something like Extinction Rebellion is exactly what they want.
Aaron, I want to. So we get a question on each section. Where did I find this question? Oh, I've lost it. But anyway, someone asked, will the Premier League still be able to get decent players if Jeremy Corbyn's plans for football come into place?
Well, depends which club you ask. They're not getting decent players in anyway. There are 4 or 5.
That's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it?
No, there are 4. No, there are 4 or 5 clubs which basically. First of all,
Which hoover up all the good... Yeah,
First
I see
of
what you
all,
mean.
first of all, the success of the Premier League is arguably to the active detriment to the rest of professional football in the country, right? We have 4 professional leagues in this country. The Premier League is just one of them. There's a great book out there by a guy called Adrian Tenpenny, I hope I said his name correctly, about And the Sun Also Shines. Maybe somebody can find it in the comments. And he was at Hillsborough in the 80s, and he talks about basically the Premier League as a cultural vehicle for neoliberalism.
Really?
From the early 1990s. Amazing book.
Makes sense.
Basically the rest of the game's really suffered as a result. You look at the collapse recently of Bury, Bolton went into administration, Portsmouth went into administration. You've got all these local clubs. What's interesting is a lot of them are in Brexit voting areas, which is why I think as a politics, this could be a really interesting way of sort of pivoting a lot of people who are right now very ambivalent about Labour at best towards a more socialist kind of political disposition.
It's very smart going after that. Yeah, I mean,
in terms of the Premier League, I personally think it would be a socialist fan ownership vision of football would mean that there's a far greater emphasis on youth development. So you'd have more clubs being like Ajax, for instance. Ajax, by the way, last year, and Ajax have essentially something resembling fan ownership, even though they also have some of their equities listed on the stock market. They emphasise good young players. They got to the Champions League semi-finals last year. Bayern Munich, effectively all the clubs in Germany, apart from a few, are fan-owned, 50+1.
that's my understanding.
Yeah, Bayern Munich, one of the most successful clubs in Europe. Similar with Borussia Dortmund, one of the most successful clubs in Europe. You know, Bayern Munich, I think, apart from Liverpool and Man City, will beat any English team very easily. So I don't think the idea that, if you have these proposals, you would necessarily have inferior teams. Barcelona, Real Madrid, Ajax, Bayern Munich. All of these have an element of fan ownership. So I don't think it would mean, less quality football, no.
I think I'm going to end on Oliver Kant's comment, not a question. Also, thanks, David, for being a legend. I found Navarra through following you, funnily enough. So isn't that nice?
That is nice.
I think we're going to end it there. Thank you, David Graeber, so much for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Aaron Bastani, a pleasure as always.
And The Sun Shines Now is the book. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Navarra Media. Thank you for watching Tiski Sour. As you know, this is only possible because of your kind support. So if you haven't already, please go to support.navarramedia.com and get the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Potentially, our next show will be in our new studio. So you can look forward to a backdrop other than...
and I won't
the
have to take
shipping
a stupid
container in
Uber,
Bermondsey.
you know.
Yeah,
to
you can
like
get there by
here,
tube
You
next
got an Uber?
time.
Oh, God,
Yeah.
don't say that.
Yeah.
Don't tell the minicab
Well, I was
drivers.
late.
That's fine.
Good night.